All right. Andy is predisposed tonight. I don't know what he's doing, but he reached. All right, he's in a meeting in Dixon, and so he asked me to fill in for him, and I said I would. So here we are. We're going to be looking at questions people ask of preachers, staying on topic, but I'm not a preacher, so I have to guess a little bit. But I think one of the questions preachers get asked is why. Why does this happen? Why did that happen? I'm sure Andy's gone over several doctrinal things or maybe puzzling scriptures where people ask preachers about, how do you discern this? What do you make of that? But I think preachers also get asked a lot of times the question, why does this happen? And Andy's even shared some of those with me where he's been involved with folks who have had tragic situations and been asked why things happened. But let me first, just on a slightly humorous note, I guess humor's in the ear of the beholder, so you can tell me, but rule out some why questions that we're not going to talk about here at first. Why do birds suddenly appear every time you are near? Some of you know the answer to that, if you know the Carpenters. Why is lemon juice made with artificial flavor and dishwashing liquid made with real lemons? I think that's a valid question. Why do doctors call what they do practice? Why don't more psychics win the lottery? Why does your nose run but your feet smell? And why is tomato a fruit but ketchup is not a smoothie? Think about that one. But those are some we will not be covering tonight. And there may, in fact, be no specific why question that we cover. Tonight, I want us to leave with two things in mind. One, we may not always have what we think is a satisfactory answer to the question, why? And two, sometimes the why doesn't need a good answer. And I don't mean to diminish anybody who's had struggles with a why type question in their life. Why did this happen? Those can be very serious, and many people's faith is shaken by events that cause them to ask why. But I want us to leave with some assurance that we don't have to know. But there are some things that can give us consolation, even if we don't have the ability to parse out why this or that happened. The question why. I think most of the time we ask that question when something has happened that we don't really care for. Something that is troubling, exhausting, bad. And sometimes we can know, sometimes we can't. Let's look at some examples from the Bible just to get our appetites going a little bit tonight. Look at the example of David, 2 Samuel 12. We're going to look first at verse 19. But when David saw that his officials were whispering to one another, he realized that the child, Bathsheba's child, and his, of course, was dead. Is the child dead? David asked them. Yes, he is dead, they answered. Now, why did this happen to David? Well, step back just a few verses to verses 13 and 14, and you'll see the prophet Nathan telling David that this was going to happen and why it happened. Then David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. Nathan replied, the Lord has taken away your sin. You will not die. But since you have shown total contempt for the Lord by this affair, the son that is born to you must die. So sometimes bad things happen because we're reaping what we've sown. You can probably all think back to examples in your life, and I could as well, of things that have happened that were suboptimal, things we did not want. And then we look at the reason, it's like, well, I made a bad choice. I did something that I shouldn't have done. And so this is reaping what I have sown. So that's one reason. And sometimes you can make a pretty good connection. You can see that these results are due to your actions. Let's look at the example of Joseph in Genesis chapter 50. In verse 15, Joseph's brothers are going to own up to what they've done. It says, when his brothers saw their father was dead, they said, it may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him. Well, why did all this evil happen to Joseph? Some people like to blame Joseph and say, well, he shouldn't have been bragging about his dreams, and he shouldn't have been wearing that flashy coat. I don't tend to put too much blame on Joseph for this. It's because evil exists in the hearts of men, and that evil is active. If you look at Joseph's brethren, to varying degrees, some wanted to sell him off, some wanted to kill him. Ultimately, of course, you know he was sold into slavery, served in Potiphar's house, falsely accused, sent to prison, given hope that he could get out, forgotten about for a long period of time, and eventually got out of prison and began what we consider his ascension to power there in the land of Egypt. So why did this happen to Joseph? Well, verse 19, Joseph said to them, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant it evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive, as they are today. So do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones." Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. They meant it for evil. Sometimes the bad things that happen to us are because not of things of our own doing, but because the evils of others. And we can look at this world and think, why should we be subject to mistreatment? Why should we be subject to the evil choices of others? And sometimes we find the answers given perhaps more satisfactory than others, but we're in a fallen creation. And the reality is that not only are we free moral agents, but those around us are as well. And in addition to that, sometimes when others choose evil, we get to grow from it. And God's kingdom gets to grow from it. And God gets to be glorified through our handling of it. And that's what Joseph's getting at when he says, but God meant it for good. Tuck that away, because we're going to come back to that. There's a little bit of perception at play. There's a little bit of timing at play when we categorize something as problematic or as painful or as evil, an evil consequence. There are things that on the surface we would not choose. But in looking back, we can see that we grew from an experience, that we grew from a mistreatment, that we relied more greatly on God and His wisdom that He provides, and on His love and care for us. So they meant it for evil, God meant it for good. As our third example, before we sort of dig into our verse that we'll be focusing on for the first part of class tonight, let's look at the example of Job. I think we're all familiar with his story, but let's refresh ourselves as to exactly how this series of events played out for Job. It is literally one servant after another coming up and giving him terrible news. Looking at chapter 1, beginning with verse 13. Now there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the oldest brother's house. And there came a messenger to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them. And the Sabians fell upon them and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword. And I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. And I alone have escaped to tell you. And while he was yet speaking, there came another and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 groups and made a raid on the camels and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword. And I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they are dead. And I alone have escaped to tell you. Now, anybody want to tell me why this happened to Job? Because verse 12. What does verse 12 say?
Satan was able to take everything into his power to test him, but he couldn't harm him.
There's a conversation, an interesting conversation. We're actually going to rewind to verse 6 of chapter 1 and look at it. But conversation between Satan and God. And I know of no reason to think that that was a one-time only conversation. If you look at this, it's almost like, well, just Satan just strolled by and they had this talk. You think God and Satan have exchanges today? I don't think we think about that, but when you think about the war, the spiritual war, and the principalities and the powers that exist, there's something going on around us all the time, conflict going on around us all the time that we can't see, but we know it's there. And I think this is a peek into that battle, into that scene here in Job chapter 1. Let's look at verse 6 and following. And now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on all the earth, a blameless and upright man, who fears God and turns away from evil?" Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "Does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. Wow, the reason here is a little more complicated, a little more layered, I think, than perhaps the first two that we looked at. Certainly the tragedies that occurred were the work of Satan. God tells Satan, all that he has is yours, don't hurt him. That's the limitation. So Satan sent fire and wind and Chaldeans and Sabians, and all those people afflicted Job. But it was with God's permission, right? And it's actually perhaps not necessarily sought out by God, but he brought Job up. He said, "Have you considered my servant Job?" And why would God do that? Well, think about all the people that have been encouraged by the book of Job through the millennia since it's been written. I think that's one reason. But sometimes bad things happen and we ask why. Because Satan is active. Satan has power still. His head has been bruised by Christ as he bruised Christ's heel at the cross. But he maintains he's the ruler of this world. He's the prince of the powers of the air. And so he is still powerful today. And I think also the observation that God allows things to happen is still valid today as well. God certainly could suspend any kind of tragedy that you want to think about. But he allows things to happen. He doesn't isolate or insulate his people or any other people from the tragedies of the fallen world in which we exist. So there are some reasons that you could suggest for why bad things happen. And of course, the notion of persecutions and other trials and tribulations in the New Testament, we know that the trying of your faith produces patience, and it lets you partake in the sufferings of Christ, and it lets you set an example for others. So there are those things as well. But I want to make it a little bit of a murkier picture, if you will, so that maybe we can think about it a little bit more like God wants us to think about it. If you look at Ecclesiastes 9:11, which is where we're going to go in just a moment, you're going to see some things that maybe we don't think about. And, we humans like to think we've got everything figured out, right? We've been to the moon. We've got all the world's information basically in our back pocket or in our phone case. We can do mighty things. We can drive. We can fly. We can do tremendous things with the advancements that we've made as civilization over the years. We don't like to think that there are things that we don't understand, that there are things we can't reason through. But Ecclesiastes 9:11 is going to say, you're not always going to be able to connect the dots to your actions, the actions of others, the actions of Satan, or the actions of God necessarily. That some things just happen. And what do we do with those? When there are things that happen that we can't explain, and those may be more frequent than we think. I think there's sometimes that we think we know why something happened, but perhaps we don't know exactly why it happened in the moment. But do we feel like we have to figure it out? And do we struggle when we can't figure it out? And if we feel that burden of trying to figure everything out, put it all together and make sense of it, I want us to relieve ourselves of that notion and that burden tonight. The Bible does teach that we're going to reap what we sow, but it also tells us that not everything is under the control of ourselves or others. Ecclesiastes 9:11. And again I saw that under the sun the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to the intelligent, nor favor to those with knowledge, but time and chance happen to them all. I want us to spend some time on that notion that time and chance happen. There are things in life that just happen. It's not someone's fault. It's not necessarily God's will in that He's looking at this item and saying, I enjoy that. His will is being done in that He's created a system where we have choices and where He provides providential protection and where time and chance are an element in our everyday lives. That's His will, is that we live within that. And His ultimate will, of course, is that we spend eternity with Him. But not everything that goes on down here on this ball of dirt is something that He approves of or something that He enjoys. Let's look at a lighthearted example here. Lighthearted more for some than others, but let me ask this why question to you. Why did Nick Saban lose to Tennessee last Saturday? There are lots of reasons folks would come up with. I'm not going to go into them. But I will say this. He lost because he was the coach of the Alabama Crimson Tide, and the Alabama Crimson Tide scored fewer points than the Tennessee Volunteers. Well, let's go back a step further. Why is Nick Saban the coach of the Alabama Crimson Tide? Well, in 2006, he was the coach of the Miami Dolphins, and they had just completed a 9-7 season. He thought the only thing he needed was a quarterback, and they would be playoff contenders for the next season. So he had his eyes set on Drew Brees, who was just played a year under the franchise tag for the Chargers and was a free agent. Could sign with whomever he wanted. And so he wanted to sign Drew Brees. And ultimately, he did not sign Drew Brees. And he says, and I think he said this fairly recently, within the last 3 or 4 years, that it was at that moment that he decided, I'm getting out of here, I'm not staying here. Here being Miami. He did suffer through another year. They signed Dante Culpepper and went 6-10. And ultimately, he left for the job and the money, the greener pastures in Tuscaloosa. So he lived up to his thoughts that I'm getting out of here because I didn't get Drew Brees. Well, why didn't he get Drew Brees? Well, if you rewind back to December 31st of 2005, the Chargers were playing their final game of the season. A game that was meaningless. They were out of playoff contention. And Drew Brees was the starting quarterback. And he dropped back near his own goal line, was blitzed by John Lynch, fumbled the ball, dove for it at the same time that Gerard Warren dove for it. Gerard Warren was 6'4", 325 pounds. So he landed in such a way on Drew Brees that it tore his labrum, it damaged his rotator cuff, and dislocated his shoulder. And in spite of Dr. James Andrews, the miracle doctor, if you will, of all things orthopedic in Birmingham, Alabama, he didn't pay me for that endorsement. You hear his name all the time, whether it be baseball, football, basketball, whatever. He's always doing surgery of an athlete. But he had repaired Drew Brees, passed the sniff test with him, but Miami's doctors, their medical staff, did not sign off on Drew Brees because of his injury. And as a result of that, they didn't sign him as a free agent. And Nick Saban had a painful season and went to Alabama. So now answer the question, why did Nick Saban lose a week ago? Well, it's a little deeper than just they scored fewer points, right? He lost because he was the coach, and he was the coach because something happened in 2006 where he didn't get what he wanted, and that happened because of something that happened in 2005. The thing that happened in 2005 was because somebody blitzed, somebody dove at just the right angle with just the right momentum to land on this prized quarterback and mess his shoulder up. I say that to say time and chance happen. At that moment, no one would have looked at that and thought, ooh, that's going to give Tennessee a victory 15, 20 years later. That's not a logical connection. But are there things in our lives, little moments? Maybe think about how you met your spouse. Maybe you saw them in a dining hall at school, and that's because you chose to eat breakfast late, so you were eating lunch late, so you just happened to be there at the same time as him or her, and you met, and the rest is history. There are things that seem small or inconsequential that turn out to be things that affect us for a long time. We don't recognize them in the moment, and perhaps we don't even recognize them in retrospect, that these things happen. But there's an element of time and chance and randomness and small, seemingly inconsequential things that affect us in life. And sometimes the why is just, that's the way it happened, right? Or that's because 1,000 things happened, and it's manifesting itself in this one moment. So when we look around us, we have to realize not everything is caused by God. Not everything is preferred or approved by God, even though it might be allowed by Him. Part of the world, as God has designed it, and we'll talk a little bit about this notion in a few minutes, but part of the world is, as God has designed it, is that some things just happen and that things wear out, us included. Let's spend just a little moment on that topic first, the time element. Sometimes we ask, well, why is my mother sick on her deathbed? Or why is my spouse struggling with their memory or motor skills? Or why do I feel so much worse than I used to feel? And part of that is just, again, that we are in a fallen world and that those things happen. It's the effect of time. The reality is that we're all going to die. Some of us are going to get old and die, and some of us maybe will die before we get old. But it's going to happen. Ecclesiastes 12, 1 through 8. Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come and the years draw near, of which you will say, I have no pleasure in them. Before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are darkened and the clouds return after the rain. In the day when the keepers of the house tremble and the strong men are bent. This is metaphorical language referring to the human body. And the grinders cease because they are few, and those who look through the windows are dimmed, and the doors on the street are shut. When the sound of grinding is low, and one rises up at the sound of a bird, and all the daughters of song are brought low. They are afraid also of what is high, and terrors are in the way. The almond tree blossoms, the grasshopper drags itself along, and desire fails, because man is going to his eternal home, and the mourners go about the streets. Before the silver cord is snapped, or the golden bowl is broken, or the pitcher is shattered at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the cistern, and the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. All is vanity. So part of the reason the things happen that cause us to ask why are because time catches up with all of us, and everyone passes away. Let's look at the element of chance now. As we've mentioned, there is a randomness to life. This scripture says that not every victory is tied to effort or talent. The fastest runner doesn't always win the race. The strongest combatant doesn't always win the battle. The wisest don't always have all that they need, and the smartest are not always the richest. The ones with the most knowledge don't curry the most favor. Some other verses that are very similar to this. Matthew 5:45, the second part of that verse says, For he makes the sun rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. not every blessing is tied to faithfulness. The evil receive sun and water in their crops just as the faithful do. Now, we do have an abundant life, but we don't necessarily have greater physical blessings just because of our faithfulness or the righteousness that God has blessed us with. Nor is every curse tied to evil or mistakes. So look at John 9, verses 1 through 3. And he, being Christ, passed by. He saw a man blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. See, a very Jewish thought was that if you were born with some sort of infirmity or illness or had developed some sort of infirmity, that it was because of some evil deed, either on the part of you or your parents, that caused you to have this infirmity. And then similarly, they tied faithfulness to abundance and to riches. This notion that chance happens is contrary to a lot of the things we hear. This notion that evil isn't necessarily tied to mistakes, and abundance is not, and blessings are not necessarily tied to faithfulness and righteousness, is contrary to perhaps what we want to believe. Take these, for example. The good guy always wins. Well, if you're talking about in eternity, yeah. But a lot of times we apply that to this earth. Well, the good guy is always going to win. Crime doesn't pay. No, crime pays. It's a short-term payment with a lifetime, an eternity, if you will, to pay off. But we really can't say crime doesn't pay. You can be anything you want to be. No. Time and chance are going to happen, and maybe you're not going to get that opportunity. Maybe you're going to have something that keeps you from being what you want to be. Everything happens for a reason. I think the notion of time and chance having a big impact on our lives would help us see that not everything necessarily happens for a reason. We're going to talk about a similar concept, though, to wrap up here in just a few minutes. And then the prosperity gospel. You listen to these preachers on TV that say, if you give money, you're going to get a blessing. You give $1,000, you're going to get a little blessing. You give $10,000, you're going to get a huge blessing. Tying blessings to contributions that will line their pockets, that's not consistent with many, many parts of the Bible, and certainly not necessarily consistent with Ecclesiastes 9 and verse 11. There is in this world in which we live an abundance of what we like to call unfairness. Is the world fair? No. Sturgill Simpson has a song, Life Ain't Fair and the World is Mean. Pretty good summary, right? And Ecclesiastes says, yeah, it's not fair. That's the way God has designed it. Well, if you had been involved back before creation, if God had said, come on in, we're going to have a panel discussion about how this world needs to look, how this creation needs to function. Maybe we would have said something like this. The world, the earth, the creation is going to be better if righteous people live a really long, happy life and maintain their full health. Because they're going to be able to impact people, and the righteous life is going to be much more attractive if that's the way the world is set up. Or maybe they say, well, wouldn't the world be better if the generous Christians, if your generous people were all ridiculously rich? Think of all the good works that could be done if the wealth of the world was concentrated among those who are the most generous and loving. Or maybe we could say, wouldn't it be better if God's people were all very intelligent and excellent communicators so that the gospel, as it's being taught, could have its widest acceptance? I think these all, on the surface, seem like reasonable suggestions. But that's not the way God created it. So why would God create a world that would ultimately be so unfair? Any thoughts from you guys? I haven't tapped into this consolidated knowledge much. Jacob commented, but he's questionable. What about it? Why would God create a world that ultimately is unfair? Maybe you haven't thought about it today. Maybe you're sleepy. I don't know. But I can tell you what I think, and you can tell me if it makes any sense. Here are my thoughts on such a question. Due to God's great love and mercy, He created a world that maximizes the likelihood that man will be saved. But at the same time, God was constrained to create a world that was perfectly consistent with His characteristics as God. Characteristics such as justice and righteousness. So we look at it and we say, hey, this would be a better way. But God sees that, not just good-looking, happy, well-fed, rich, healthy people can have an impact. Broken people can have an impact. And God sees that, if people were rewarded with earthly things because of obedience, perhaps their motives would be flipped, and they would ultimately serve their belly and as a proxy for serving God. I don't know. A couple more thoughts, though, that do help me not lose any sleep over this. Is Deuteronomy 29:29. The secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things that are revealed to us and to our children forever, that we may do all the works of this law. The secret things belong to the Lord. And then Isaiah 55:8-9. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. God has some characteristics that we don't have. God has a lot of knowledge that we don't have. God has some wisdom that we aren't born with. We can tap into it through His Word and through asking for it. But He is sovereign. He is loving. He is merciful. And He is just. And the world that He created was the best world that He could create within those constraints. And ultimately, man messed it up in the garden. And thus we are left to deal with the fall in creation, the results of sin, and the ugliness that surrounds us every day. As we look at it and maybe ask why, maybe we can think, well, this is because God wants me to know exactly how ugly sin is. And He wants me to yearn for something more. He wants me to pray, Lord, come quickly, because I'm so tired of this earth and so in love with Him that I want to go to heaven. So the takeaway from Ecclesiastes 9:11, I think, is that some things just happen. And the application for us is that we don't always have to assign a reason for everything that happens to us, whether it be bad or good. We have to be careful when we say things like, well, God closed that door because He has something better for me. God always has something better for you, but that door may not have closed as a result of God's desires for you. I got a promotion at work, so God must be pleased with how I'm living. My child isn't faithful, so I must have failed as a parent. Or this thing that has happened is a sign from God. Or God took this person because He needed him or her in heaven. The danger of this type of thinking is that we can misattribute things to God, causing us to pursue things that make us happy. For example, I got this promotion at work, so God must be happy with me being a lukewarm Christian. He must be content with that, because I'm better than most of the world. I got some growing to do, but I'm fine in my current state because God is blessing me. Well, if we make that attribution, then we get lazy and we don't get any better. And we think, well, I can just double down on what I am and God's going to keep blessing me because He must be happy with me. And we can misattribute things to God, causing us to resent Him for something He hasn't done. We can look at the death of a loved one and think, well, this must be God's doing, but I can't understand why He did it. And we can grow to have resentment or doubt, perhaps, in our heart. Or perhaps we can fail to see the blessings that exist in the trials and the struggles of life. On the other hand, if we look at everything merely as time and chance, like, okay, God has just wound this world up and now he's sitting back with his hands folded waiting for the day of judgment. That's the deist view that you read about, that God is detached from his creation. We have to be careful not to swing in that direction, because not everything that happens is time and chance. God is very active in this world. And if you question that, I'll commit to your reading Daniel 2, verses 20 through 22, 2 Chronicles 16, actually, verse 9. I will read that one. For the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth to give strong support to those whose heart is blameless towards him. That's not a God that's passive. That's a God that's active on our behalf. Matthew 6:26 talks about the birds of the air, how God takes care of them, and surely he will take care of his children. So how do we navigate all this? We have the knowledge that God is active, that he's doing things to benefit his people. He's doing things to draw us closer to him. But at the same time, being careful to say, well, this was from him, and this was from evil that I did, and this was from Satan, and trying to get those right. I think if we take a deep breath, we can know that God is active without being able to attribute individual things that happen to us. It takes faith. We don't see God's hand, but we know it's there. And we know that good and perfect gifts come from him. Sometimes those come in the form of things we don't want because we're short-sighted or we're selfish or we're scared. It takes faith in this specific promise, and this is the scripture we'll close with as I wrap up. Romans 8:28. You kind of knew we were going to go there. We talked a little bit about keeping that thought tucked away, but God meant it to me for good. The words that Joseph said to his brothers after he says, in contrast, that they meant it for evil. God can work with anything. Whether it's something he did, you did, somebody else did, or Satan did, he can work with it. And he promises that he will. Romans 8:28. We know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. I want you to think about a jigsaw puzzle. Maybe some of you work puzzles, maybe some of you don't. But when it's time to assemble a puzzle, what do? You take the pieces out. You orient them correctly. You put them face up. You maybe separate the pieces by edge versus middle versus corner. Maybe you get similar colors together and arrange them in a certain way. And most importantly, you probably take the lid of the box and set it up so you can study the scene that you're trying to assemble, right? You ever look at an individual piece and think, that's kind of ugly, Or how does that fit with this other stuff? Where does that belong? It's not always apparent to us how things join together. But Romans 8:28 begs us to know that the puzzle pieces that we are collecting, the things that are happening to us, the things that we are doing as we walk through this life, the ugly ones, the oddly shaped ones, the ones that don't seem to fit, maybe some are actually beautiful in their own right, on their own merit. All of those can be assembled in this scene that's before us. God can put it all together just as he designed it to be. Let's consider some pieces of the puzzle that the master craftsman has used in the past. David's sin with Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah. The home of Rahab, the prostitute. The suffering of Joseph at the hands of his brethren and of Potiphar. The infertility of Hannah. The death of Stephen, a demon-possessed woman. A glance between a teacher and his denying disciple. A cup of water. A boy's lunch of loaves and fishes. A prayer from Elijah. A thorn in the flesh. A storm on the sea. Things that maybe don't seem appealing, maybe seem small and insignificant. Those are all pieces that God can put together, according to Romans 8:28. Well, what does this mean to us? Well, God can put together pieces that we encounter as well. Financial hardship, depression and anxiety, war, slowly losing a loved one to dementia, persecution, the prayer of a child, our faithfulness in small things, our shame, our doubts, our fears, and our pain. So in closing, I would just say that when we look at our pieces, the things that we receive from or in this life, and we ask why. As we look at those pieces and we fumble with them, trying to make sense of them, and we struggle to know how they fit together, and we find ourselves asking, Lord, why? When we find ourselves in this spot, may we approach the Father's throne in prayer with our pieces in hand and leave them at His feet, trusting that He knows what He's doing, and He will assemble them to create a beautiful picture for you and for me, an eternal one, just as He has promised in Romans 8:28. So again, we may not have answered any of the why questions, but hopefully we've realized that there doesn't always have to be an obvious answer, because sometimes it doesn't matter what we think about it or how we attribute it. It's all raw material that God can use to create good for us, work it together for our good. Any thoughts, comments, questions before we wrap up? All right. Oh, Joed.
Somebody asked you, how could a God so good let all of these wicked and bad things happen? It's going to take a little bit of study. It's not a simple one-liner you give.
No. No, they're going to have to get acquainted with God's characteristics. They're going to have to get acquainted with His Son and His Son's suffering and with substitutional sacrifices. There's a lot that would have to be taught, and we shouldn't trivialize that question when people ask it, because most of us, I think, in here have a lifetime of Bible study probably at our disposal, and we benefit from it. Not everyone comes at it from the same angle we do, so that's a great call out. Appreciate that. Any other thoughts? All right. Have a great rest of the week, and Andy will be back next week. So